On a gray December afternoon in 1872, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a sailor aboard the Canadian brigantine DEI Gratu looked out across the water and saw something that took a moment to make sense of. A ship was moving under sail. Her canvas was set and drawing, her hull was upright, her masts were intact, and yet something about the way she moved was wrong. She was yawing slightly, drifting off course in small increments, the way a vessel moves when no hand is on the wheel. The men watching her from the DEI Gratu could see no one at the helm. They could see no one on deck at all. The ship was the Mary Celeste, a brigantine out of New York, and she had departed that port less than a month earlier, bound for Genoa, Italy. She was carrying cargo, and she had aboard a full crew of 7 sailors, along with her captain, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter. On this December afternoon, the DEI Gratu crew watching her cross the gray Atlantic swells could not have known any of that yet. What they could see was a full-rigged vessel sailing herself across open water, with no human being visible anywhere on her decks, her sails set and her course slightly wandering, the winter light falling flat on the water around her. Captain David Morehouse of the DEI Gratu recognized the Mary Celeste. He had seen her in New York before both ships departed. He knew her captain, Benjamin Briggs, at least by acquaintance, and what he was looking at across the water did not match anything in his experience of the sea. A ship that size, properly crewed, would have someone at the wheel and someone on watch. The absence of any figure at any point along her rail, in any position visible from the DEI Gratu's deck, was not something a passing squall or a sleeping crew could account for. Morehouse ordered a boat lowered. The DEI Gratu's first mate, Oliver DeVoe, was the man who first stepped aboard the Mary Celeste and walked through her empty spaces. What he found, the stores, the personal effects, the open log, the cargo intact in the hold below, was a ship that had not been abandoned in any panic or emergency that left visible marks. She was, as far as any inspection could establish, intact. She had simply lost her people somewhere in the days between her last log entry and this gray December afternoon when she came drifting across the path of the DEI Gratu with no one at her wheel. The question of what happened to those people, to Captain Briggs, to his wife Sarah, to their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and to the 7 sailors who made up the Mary Celeste's crew, has never been answered with any certainty. The record stops at the last log entry. The ship continued without them. What makes the Mary Celeste remarkable within a broader tradition of maritime mystery is that she was not alone. The ocean has, over the centuries of recorded seafaring, produced a small and specific category of vessel that falls outside the ordinary endings of ships at sea. Ships are lost to storms, to fire, to reef and shoal, and ice. They sink, they burn, they run aground with their crews still aboard. The Mary Celeste did none of those things. She continued sailing, and she was not the only one. The Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted commercial schooner, one of the largest working sailing vessels of her era, and on January 31st, 1921, she was found hard aground on Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, a stretch of shoal water so dangerous to navigation that it had earned the informal name Graveyard of the Atlantic long before the Deering arrived there. The ship had run aground, but her 5 masts were still standing. Her rigging was intact, and in the rigging, still hanging where they had been placed, were red distress lights, the kind of signal a crew rigs when they are in trouble and want to be seen. All 11 of her crew members were missing. Diamond Shoals is a place where the sea runs shallow over shifting sandbanks several miles off the Cape, and vessels that get into trouble there tend to get into serious trouble. A ship that size aground on those shoals, with her 5 masts still upright and her rigging still dressed with distress signals, presented an unusual picture. The signals suggested that at some point before she grounded, or as she was grounding, someone aboard had intended to be found and helped. The missing crew suggested that either help had not come, or that whatever had taken the crew had taken them before the grounding ever happened. No one aboard, and no investigation after the fact could say which. The Carol A. Deering had departed Bath, Maine in August of 1920, sailed to South America, and was on her return passage north along the Atlantic coast when she came to rest on Diamond Shoals. She had been seen and spoken to in the days before her grounding. A passing vessel reported exchanging signals with her, and nothing in those exchanges suggested anything wrong. The last sighting of her under normal operation was routine. The next observation of her, from the shore and from the vessels that eventually came to investigate, was a 5-masted schooner hard on the shoals with no crew and red lights still in her rigging. Farther from the Atlantic, in the wide South Pacific, the ocean produced another case of this specific and quiet kind. The MV Joyita was a small motor vessel originally built in California in the 1930s as a pleasure craft and later pressed into service as a passenger and cargo vessel in the Pacific Islands trade. On October 3, 1955, she departed Samoa bound for the Tokelau Islands, a passage that under normal conditions would take about 2 days. She carried 25 people, passengers and crew, along with medical supplies and other cargo. She did not arrive. When the Joyita was found on November 10, 1955, she was approximately 600 miles off her intended course, drifting and listing heavily to one side. Her superstructure had been partly damaged. Her medical supplies were gone. She was taking on water, though she had not sunk and showed no signs of sinking, a fact that has a specific technical explanation, since the Joyita's hull had been lined with cork insulation that kept her buoyant even when she was waterlogged. The 25 people who had been aboard were gone. No life rafts were found with the vessel. The ocean between where she had been and where she was had not given any of them back. What had happened to the Joyita's passengers and crew in the 37 days between her departure and her discovery was not established by the investigation that followed. The boat had been traveling a known route. She had been expected. She had not arrived, and then she had been found without her people, drifting low in the Pacific swell with her decks awash, and the wide southern sky above her. The exact nature of whatever had gone wrong was not recovered from the wreck. Neither were the people. These 3 vessels, the Mary Celeste, the Carol A. Deering, the Joyita, represent the kind of abandonment that leaves investigators with a ship and without an explanation. They were not found on the bottom. They were not reported lost and then simply never located. They were found drifting or grounded, largely intact, and emptied of the people who had been living and working aboard them. Each investigation produced a set of incomplete findings and a set of unanswered questions, and those questions are still unanswered now. The most persistent ghost ship in the documented record is one that takes this category of maritime mystery and extends it far beyond any of the others, not in the drama of its abandonment, but in the sheer duration of its aftermath. The SS Bedtime was a 322-ton Hudson's Bay Company cargo steamship operating in the waters of the Arctic Ocean, and her story is in some respects the most patient of all the ghost ship stories the sea has produced. The Bedtime had been working the Arctic for years by the autumn of 1931, supplying remote trading posts along the northern Canadian and Alaskan coasts in the brief window each year when the ice retreated enough to allow navigation. In October of 1931, near the Alaskan settlement of Barrow, she became trapped in pack ice, a standard hazard of Arctic operation, and one that her crew had managed before. The ice closed in, and the ship was locked. The Hudson's Bay Company flew an aircraft to evacuate most of the crew. A small group of men stayed aboard to wait out the freeze, sheltering in a temporary structure built on the ice nearby. In November of 1931, a severe blizzard struck the region. It lasted for days. When it was over and visibility returned, the men who had been waiting on the ice went to where the Bechimo had been frozen in and found that she was gone. The ice had shifted in the storm, and the ship had broken free. She had sailed herself away into the Arctic. That by itself would be remarkable enough. A ship escaping from pack ice in a storm and drifting away unmanned was unusual, but not without precedent in Arctic waters, where ice movement could be unpredictable and violent. What followed was something more particular. The Bechimo did not sink. She was sighted within the same month, about 45 miles from where she had been lost, and a small group of men managed to board her briefly. They found her still afloat, but determined she was not seaworthy enough to sail back, and they left her there. She drifted on. Over the following years, the Bechimo was spotted again and again. An Inuit hunter saw her drifting between ice floes. A prospector reported seeing her in the Beaufort Sea. A group of people managed to board her in 1935 and spent 10 days aboard before ice conditions prevented them from sailing her back to port. She was reported by Inuit groups, by passing vessels, by coastal observers at various points along the Arctic coast of Alaska. Each sighting confirmed that she was still afloat, still drifting, still intact enough to be recognized as the Bechimo, and each time, the ice or the weather or the sheer practical difficulty of managing a large unmanned ship in Arctic waters prevented anyone from bringing her in. By any ordinary reckoning, she should not have lasted. An unmanned ship drifting through Arctic pack ice, the same ice that crushed vessels with proper hulls and maintained systems, was not supposed to survive for years, let alone decades. The Arctic was hard on ships under the best conditions, with crew aboard and engines running, and a captain making decisions about where to take the hull and where not to. An empty ship in those waters, with no one managing her, should have been ground to pieces quickly. The Bechimo was not. She kept being sighted. She kept drifting. The last confirmed sighting of the SS Bechimo was in 1969, 38 years after she had broken free from the ice near Barrow and sailed herself away into the Arctic Ocean. She was seen that year in the Beaufort Sea, still afloat, still identifiable as the ship she had been. After that, she was not reported again. The pack ice and the Arctic winter eventually claimed her, or she sank somewhere remote enough that no one was there to see it, or she simply drifted beyond the range of any observer. No one knows exactly when or where the Bechimo finally went under. The record stops at 1969. The Mary Celeste, meanwhile, had a story with a clear beginning and a clear middle, even if the middle contains the mystery. She was built in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, in 1861 under the name Amazon, and she had a troubled early history. Her first captain died shortly after her completion. She suffered a minor collision on her first voyage, and she eventually ran aground off Nova Scotia in 1867 and was sold at salvage auction. She was repaired, refitted, registered in New York, and her name was changed to Mary Celeste. By 1872, she was a working brigantine with a good cargo, a capable captain, and a passage ahead of her across the Atlantic. Captain Benjamin Briggs was an experienced mariner, regarded by those who knew him as careful and competent. He was 44 years old in 1872, and the voyage to Genoa was not his first command. He had brought his wife Sarah along on previous voyages, and on this one, he brought both Sarah and their daughter Sophia, who was 2 years old. His decision to bring his family speaks to something about the character of the voyage as he anticipated it, not a dangerous run, not an emergency posting, but a working passage on a familiar kind of ship, across waters he had crossed before. The Mary Celeste departed New York on November 7th, 1872. She carried a cargo of 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol, bound for a customer in Genoa. The crew of 7 was experienced. The weather in the North Atlantic in November could be difficult, but the ship was in good condition and properly provisioned. Nothing about the departure suggested the voyage would be anything other than what Briggs expected. The DEI Gracia sailed from New York 8 days later on November 15th. She was also bound for Gibraltar on a similar passage across the Atlantic. The two ships were traveling similar routes, and the DEI Gracia's crew would have known the Mary Celeste by name and reputation. When they spotted her on December 4th, drifting without apparent control in the waters near the Azores, they would have recognized her. The stretch of Atlantic between New York and the Azores in November and December was not a calm or predictable place. The North Atlantic in autumn ran to swells and squalls, to sudden changes in weather and visibility, to the kind of conditions that made navigation genuinely demanding. Whatever had happened to the Mary Celeste had happened in that context, not in the tropics, not in flat water, but in the gray and variable Atlantic of a mid-autumn crossing. The specific details of what had prompted the crew to leave, and when, and in what state, and under what conditions, are not recoverable from the evidence the ship left behind. What the ship left behind was itself, largely intact, her cargo in her hold, her personal effects in her cabins, her log open on the chart table. She had been sailing herself for some number of days when the DEI Gratia found her, her sails set but not optimally trimmed, her course wandering without a hand to correct it. She had covered a significant distance since the last log entry. She was still covering distance when the DEI Gratia's crew first spotted her, a full-rigged brigantine moving across the Atlantic, swells with no one at the wheel, on a gray December afternoon, with no one visible at her rail. The specific moment of spotting, the lookout's report, the first look through a glass at the distant ship, the growing realization that something was wrong with what was visible, has a quality that the historical record preserves imperfectly, but meaningfully. The DEI Gracia's crew were experienced sailors. They would have been able to read the movement of a distant ship from the behavior of her sails, the angle of her hull in the water, the way she tracked across the waves. What they were reading, as they came closer, was a ship that had been let go. She was not damaged in any visible way. She was simply running without anyone running her. The DEI Gratia hailed the Mary Celeste. There was no response. The silence came back across the water between them. Morehouse sent DeVoe and 2 other men across in a small boat to board her. The distance between the 2 ships in those conditions, the Atlantic swell, the December light, the gray water between them, was not great, but crossing it in an open boat required some care. When they came alongside the Mary Celeste and climbed aboard, they found what they found: the ship empty, her provisions aboard, her cargo intact, her log open at its final entry from November 25th. 9 days of sailing without a crew had brought her to this position in the Atlantic, drifting slightly off course in the way of unmanned things. DeVoe made his inspection, took his notes, and sailed the Mary Celeste with the small crew he had to Gibraltar. The voyage covered several hundred miles and took several days. Managing a brigantine of that size with only 3 men in Atlantic waters in December was demanding work, and the DEI Gratia was consequently short-handed for the rest of her own passage. The practical difficulty of that delivery speaks to the size and condition of the ship they had found. She was a real vessel in sailing condition, fully laden, and she required real effort to manage. The 10 people who had been aboard the Mary Celeste, Captain Briggs, his wife, his daughter, and 7 crew members, were never found. No bodies were recovered at sea. No one came ashore anywhere along the Atlantic coast with an account of what had happened. No distress signal had been received from the ship in her final days. The record simply ended on November 25th, with a log entry placing the ship near the Azores, and then the ship continued on alone until the DEI Gratia found her on December 4th. Sophia Briggs was 2 years old. Among the things found in the cabin of the Mary Celeste were her small personal effects, a crib, some clothing, the ordinary intimate objects of a small child's life aboard a ship. They were still there, undisturbed, when DeVoe came aboard. Whatever had happened to the Mary Celeste's people had happened in a way that left the cabin of that 2-year-old child exactly as it had been when she was living in it. The crib was in its place. The small things were stowed as they would have been stowed by parents who kept careful track of such things. The room had the quality of a room that had been used recently and left tidily, not the quality of a room that had been abandoned in haste or fear. That detail, the crib, the small effects, the tidiness of what had been left, has a specific weight that is not about drama or grief, but about proportion. The Mary Celeste was a working ship, and the people aboard her were doing what working sailors and their families did. They had organized a child's space within the constraints of a brigantine's cabin. They had brought what the child needed and stowed it properly, and then they had gone, leaving all of it behind, for reasons that the ship they left behind cannot explain. The Carol A. Allen Hack, the Carol A. Teedentith Aig board, the Xebec, not even K's Inio way, the Tispafre. Deering's story, 49 years later, had a different geography and a different set of conditions, but the same essential category of ending. A large, well-found vessel found without her crew, her equipment largely intact, her rigging dressed with signals that suggested someone had been trying to attract attention. The red lights still hanging in her rigging when investigators came aboard were not the lights of a ship that had been cleanly abandoned. They were the lights of a ship that had been in some kind of trouble, or whose crew had believed they were in some kind of trouble, and had done what seafarers did when they needed help. They had put up signals, and then they had not been there when the help eventually came. Diamond Shoals had been the undoing of many ships before the Carol A. Deering came to rest there. The shoals extended well offshore in waters that looked deceptively navigable from a distance, and the combination of shallow banks, strong currents, and the weather patterns of the Cape Hatteras area had produced a long record of groundings. A 5-masted schooner hard on those shoals was not by itself unusual. A 5-masted schooner on those shoals with her crew missing and her distress signal still flying was unusual in a more particular way. The Deering had been a healthy ship. She was not old and worn out. She was not under-provisioned or undermanned. Her 11 crew members had been, as far as anyone could establish, in good health and good order at the last point where anyone had reliable information about them. The passage from South America north along the Atlantic coast was a known route, worked by many vessels. Whatever had happened to the Deering's crew had happened on a route and in a ship that gave no obvious reason for catastrophe. The Joyhita's 600-mile drift from her intended course over the 37 days between her departure and her discovery describes a ship that had lost direction that had stopped being guided and had been given over to the currents and winds of the South Pacific to arrange as they chose. 600 miles is a long way for a vessel to drift. It covers many days. Whatever happened to the Joyhita's 25 passengers and crew, it happened far enough back in time that the sea had had weeks to work on the vessel before she was found, and what the sea had done was list her and flood her and cover her decks with water, while her cork-lined hull kept her from going all the way under. The Pacific in the waters between Samoa and Tokelau was not an extreme sailing environment. It was a known passage, worked regularly by island traders. The Joyhita was not a particularly old or fragile vessel. She had made similar passages before. The 37-day gap between her departure and her discovery was not 37 days of dramatic weather or unusual conditions. It was 37 days of a ship being somewhere in the Pacific without anyone who should have been keeping watch of her being there. The SS Beichimo's story unfolded at the opposite end of the world, in the Arctic waters north of Alaska, where the conditions were nothing like the South Pacific and the sea was a fundamentally different kind of challenge. The pack ice that had held the Beichimo in 1931 was the same ice that had crushed wooden ships and steel hulls across centuries of Arctic exploration. It was not a passive hazard. It moved, and when it moved in force, it moved with enormous pressure against anything caught between its flows. That the Beichimo had broken free from it in a blizzard and survived intact was remarkable. That she had then gone on drifting through those waters for 38 years was something the record does not fully account for. The ice should have taken her. There is no obvious structural reason why it did not. Ships that were properly crewed and carefully navigated in Arctic waters were damaged and lost regularly. An empty ship following no course, making no decisions, with no one managing her hull or her ballast or her relationship to the ice around her, should have found the conditions of the Beaufort Sea and the Arctic Ocean in autumn and winter impassable. The Beichimo navigated them by accident, or by some property of her hull, or by the specific geography of the ice fields she drifted through, or by a combination of factors that no observer was present to document. She kept going, each time she was spotted, by the Inuit hunter in his kayak, by the prospector watching from a coastal bluff, by the members of the boarding party who spent 10 days living aboard her in 1935 and then had to leave her behind again. She was still recognizable as the ship she had been. 38 years of Arctic winters and Arctic pack ice had not broken her apart or sent her to the bottom. She had continued being a ship, drifting through the waters where her crew had left her, long past the time when any reasonable expectation of her survival would have expired. Her last sighting was in 1969 in the Beaufort Sea. The men who saw her that year were the last people to report laying eyes on the Beichimo. After 1969, the record is silent. She may have sunk in a year with particularly severe ice conditions. She may have drifted into a remote stretch of Arctic coast and been held there. In 2006, the government of Alaska mounted an effort to search for her wreck, using archival records to narrow down her likely location, but the search was not conclusive. The Beichimo's final position on the floor of whatever Arctic body of water eventually received her is not known. What the Arctic holds, it tends to hold for a long time. Cold water and cold sediment are preserving environments. The hulls of ships that went down in Arctic waters during the 19th century have been found in the 21st century in recognizable condition, still sitting on the bottom where they sank, the wood and metal preserved by the cold. If the Beichimo came to rest somewhere in those waters, she may still be there, held in the dark and the cold, as intact as she was when the last person to see her watched her from the deck of a passing vessel in 1969. The Atlantic, in December of 1872, was where the most famous of these empty ships was found, drifting in the gray water near the Azores, with no hand on her wheel and no voice to answer across the water. The DEI Gratia's crew brought the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar and stood before the British Admiralty Court to give their account of what they had found. The investigation ran for weeks. The questions it asked were reasonable ones. What had happened to the crew? Where had they gone? Was there evidence of foul play? Had the DEI Gratia's men known more than they were saying? The answers it came back with were incomplete. The investigation established what had not happened more clearly than it established what had. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their daughter Sophia, and the 7 sailors who had sailed with them out of New York on November 7th, 1872, were never found. The ocean between the Azores and whatever point they had left the ship received them and did not return them. The Mary Celeste went on to Gibraltar and then to other owners and other voyages, and she remained in service until 1885, when she was deliberately wrecked off Haiti in a poorly managed insurance fraud. The ship outlasted her mystery by more than a decade. Her passengers and crew did not outlast the mystery at all. In the waters north of Alaska, in the Beaufort Sea, the last recorded image of the SS Bayashimo holds something that the other ghost ship stories approach but do not quite reach. She was seen in 1969, 38 years after she broke free from the pack ice near Barrow, still afloat, still recognizable, still drifting. The people who had sailed her and provisioned her and lived aboard her in her working years were long gone, retired, or dead, or simply elsewhere in the world, grown old in the decades since the ship had last been theirs to manage. The ship had outlasted them. She had continued in the Arctic while they had continued in their lives, and she had still been there, still drifting, still holding herself above the water, long after any reasonable account of her existence would have concluded she was gone. The ocean is a patient holder of things. The Mary Celeste carried her empty decks from the Azores to Gibraltar across a December Atlantic, her sails drawing and her hull cutting water, with no one aboard to see the waves or feel the cold. The Carol A. Deering sat on Diamond Shoals with her red lights still in her rigging, waiting for the assistance that no longer served any purpose. The Joyita floated low, enlisting in the South Pacific, her cork-lined hull keeping her up through 37 days and 600 miles of open water until someone found her. And somewhere in the Arctic, in the dark, cold water of the Beaufort Sea, the Bayashimo drifted between ice floes for decades after her crew had gone, sighted and lost and sighted again, moving quietly through the place where she had been left, in no particular hurry, going nowhere, and arriving there slowly, in the long particular manner of a ship that has all the time the ocean has, and nothing pressing it forward but the slow circulation of wind and water across the top of the world. The galley of the Mary Celeste was a small room. It sat low in the hull, forward of the main hold, and the light that reached it on the afternoon of December 4th, 1872, came in at an angle, falling across a wooden work surface, and the things that had been left on it. The man who climbed down into it first was part of the salvage crew from the DEI Grazia, a Canadian brigantine that had found the Mary Celeste moving under sail, with no one at her wheel, and he would have stood for a moment in that narrow space and taken in what was around him. There were provisions. There was cooking equipment arranged in the particular way that a cook arranges things, when work is either recently finished or about to begin. The pots were where pots belong, when someone has been using them. The stores were stocked as though a voyage of some duration was still planned. What struck the salvage crew, and what would go on to occupy investigators for years afterward, was not that the galley had been ransacked, it was that it had not been. The room was orderly, it was stocked. Whatever had happened to the people who had been aboard the Mary Celeste, it had not involved anyone going below to gather food for a long journey in a small boat, stripping the provisions, or loading the kind of supplies that people take when they know they will need to sustain themselves across open water for an uncertain period. The galley held what a functioning ship's galley holds. The cook's work was there in the arrangement of things. The absence of the cook was what was missing. The provision stores of the Mary Celeste, taken as a whole, told a consistent story. The ship had departed New York on November 7th, 1872, carrying enough food and water to sustain 10 people. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their young daughter, and 7 crew members across an Atlantic crossing to Genoa, Italy. The stores found by the DEI Grazia salvage crew were largely intact, consistent with a ship that had been at sea for less than a month and had simply not consumed much of what it carried. Nothing about the quantity of provisions suggested that the people aboard had known they were leaving, or had planned to leave, or had taken what they would need. The ship was provisioned as though it expected to go on. Below the galley, and below the quarters where the crew slept and kept their things, the hold of the Mary Celeste contained the cargo it had taken on in New York. Approximately 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol, loaded and secured for delivery to Genoa, sat in the ship's hold exactly as they had been placed there before departure. The cargo manifest that the DEI Grazia crew would eventually bring before the Admiralty Court in Gibraltar matched what was in the hold. The count was nearly right. The barrels were in place. They were secured as freight is secured when it is expected to reach its destination. 9 of those barrels, when examined closely, turned out to be empty, or rather not to contain alcohol, and that small discrepancy would become significant in later discussions about what might have happened aboard the ship. But the remaining cargo was undisturbed. Nothing had been opened to extract the alcohol. Nothing had been removed. The hold had the quality of a place that had been waiting patiently for the ship to reach port. The ship's log was found in the captain's cabin. It lay where it had been placed after the last entry was made, and that entry was dated November 25th, 1872, 9 days before the DEI Grazia found the ship drifting. The handwriting was steady. The position recorded was near the Azores in the eastern Atlantic. The entry noted nothing out of the ordinary, no sign of approaching trouble, no mention of unusual weather, no indication that the person writing it believed anything was wrong or was about to go wrong. The page after that entry was blank. Whatever happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste, it happened in the 9 days between the writing of that final log entry and the afternoon the DEI Grazia spotted her, moving alone through the Atlantic swells, and the log, which had faithfully recorded the voyage up to that point, had nothing to say about it. A log kept in a steady hand, recording a position near the Azores, ending mid-voyage with a blank page. The blankness is not dramatic. It is simply where the record stops. The ship continued on without anyone to write in the log, and the log lay open in the cabin, its blank pages accumulating days. Captain Briggs had been a careful and experienced mariner. The logs and records he kept up to November 25th showed a methodical approach to recording the voyage, positions noted, conditions observed, the ordinary work of a captain who expected his documentation to be read at the other end. The entries that existed were not hurried. They were not the entries of a man who was frightened or distracted. They were plain and precise, the record of someone doing the job they had done many times before. The November 25th entry, the last one, reads like all the others. There is nothing in the final line that suggests it was written by someone who knew it would be the last thing they ever committed to that book. Personal effects throughout the ship had not been gathered for departure. In the crew quarters, clothing remained. Boots stood beside bunks in the position boots occupy when someone has recently removed them and set them down before lying down or before turning to some other task aboard the ship. The arrangement of personal items in the crew quarters carried the particular quality of things placed by people who expected to return to them, not the arrangement of a cabin that has been stripped or hurriedly searched or left in the manner of rooms abandoned under duress. The things were where people put things when they are between one part of their day and the next. This matters in the specific way that small physical details matter when they are the only evidence available. Investigators working with ghost ship cases have consistently noted that the presence or absence of personal items provides one of the more reliable indicators of whether a departure was planned. Sailors, even in emergencies, tend to take the things that matter most to them when they understand they are leaving. The pipes and tobacco found aboard the Carol A. Deering, a 5-masted commercial schooner discovered hard aground off the coast of North Carolina in January 1921, were noted by investigators for precisely this reason. A pipe is the kind of object a man reaches for in the evening without thinking about it, the way a person reaches for a familiar object at the end of a working day. Finding the pipes still aboard, still in the places where they had been rested, told investigators something specific. The men who used them had not understood, at the moment of their departure, that they were leaving. The Carol A. Deering's crew quarters told a version of the same story. Clothing had not been gathered. Personal effects had not been cleared from the spaces where sailors keep the small things that belong to them. The 11 men who had been aboard the Deering when it left Barbados on its final voyage had left behind the material record of their daily lives in exactly the condition that daily lives generate, not curated, not selected, not organized for an absence. The boots that stood beside a bunk on the Deering were standing in the way. Boots stand when someone expects to put them on again. They were upright. They were where they had been placed. The weeks between the crew's disappearance and the arrival of investigators had passed around those boots without disturbing them. It is worth staying with the specific fact of the pipes for a moment. At sea, in the period when the Deering sailed, a pipe was not a luxury that sailors easily parted with. It was a daily comfort, a ritual object, the kind of thing a person at sea develops a relationship with across months of open water and limited variety. Sailors who left ships quickly, even in emergencies, were documented to have tucked their pipes into their clothing before going over the side. The pipes on the Carol A. Deering were not in anyone's clothing. They were on surfaces in the cabins, resting where they had last been set down, in the positions of things that have been temporarily abandoned rather than left behind. Whatever drew the men away from the Deering, it appears to have drawn them without giving them time to pick up the objects they would ordinarily have carried. Back aboard the Mary Celeste, the salvage crew from the DEI Gratia continued their examination of the ship's condition. The sails, some of them, were in a state consistent with having been set in a hurry or having been caught by weather after the crew had gone, torn in places, not properly set. The rigging was in a state that was not catastrophic, but was not the state of rigging maintained by a full crew at sea. The ship had been managing on her own for some period, and the difference between a ship sailed by people and a ship sailing without them had accumulated in the small imprecisions of the sails and lines over the 9 days or more since the log had last been written. The sounding rod, the instrument used to measure the depth of water in the ship's bilges, and thus to check for flooding, was found on deck rather than stowed in its usual place. Water had accumulated in the hold, but not an extraordinary amount. The DEI Gretsch crew were able to pump it out and sail the ship. The presence of the sounding rod on deck suggested it had been used recently, that someone had been checking the bilge levels, which was a thing a captain worried about flooding might do. Taken alongside everything else, the intact provisions, the undisturbed cargo, the final log entry recording a normal position near the Azores, the sounding rod on deck was the kind of physical detail that invites inference without quite yielding to it. There was one thing missing from the Mary Celeste that was unambiguous. The yawl boat that had been mounted on the ship's main hatch was gone. A yawl is a small boat kept aboard a larger vessel for use in ferrying people and supplies between ship and shore or for emergencies. The mounting brackets on the Mary Celeste's main hatch were empty. The wood around them was scuffed, the marks left by a boat that has been moved off its mount by ropes or by hands under some degree of urgency or at least of sustained physical effort. The brackets themselves were intact. The fittings had not been torn away. The boat had been removed by people who knew how to remove it, in a manner that was deliberate rather than accidental. No wreckage of the yawl boat was ever found. The Atlantic is wide and deep, and small wooden boats leave little trace. But the absence of any wreckage, combined with the condition of the brackets on the main hatch and the scuffing of the wood around them, is consistent with a scenario in which 10 people got into the yawl boat and left the Mary Celeste under their own power and of their own choosing, or at least without visible violence or obvious force. Whatever they left for, they left in the boat. Where the boat went after that, the ocean did not record. The brackets on the main hatch of the Mary Celeste are perhaps the single most concrete piece of physical evidence in the case. Everything else aboard the ship is notable for being present. The food, the cargo, the personal effects, the log entry, the boots beside the bunks. The brackets are notable for what they show the absence of. The boat was there. The boat was removed. The boat did not come back. In a case built largely on things that were not disturbed, the one disturbance that can be clearly identified is the departure of the yawl. The main hatch itself was open when the DEI Gratia crew boarded. The hatches to the cargo hold were found in various states. Some had been opened and not properly closed, which in rough weather or following a significant swell would have allowed water into the hold. The state of the hatches was consistent with things having happened quickly, or with hatches having been opened for inspection and then left in the ordinary way things are left when the people who opened them did not return. The cargo below, the barrels of alcohol, the intact freight, sat in the hold through whatever had happened on deck, unaware of it, sealed and waiting. Those 9 empty barrels warrant a specific moment of attention. The remaining 1,692 barrels in the hold were sealed and full. The 9 that were found to be empty or not to contain alcohol had been made from red oak rather than white oak. Red oak is a slightly more porous wood, and at least some accounts of the investigation suggest that the empty barrels may have been leaking, or may have been empty on boarding for reasons related to the material of the wood rather than to any deliberate action. The distinction between 9 empty barrels and a cargo of 1,701 and nearly 1,700 barrels still fully intact and secured is the distinction between a hold that had been tampered with and a hold that had simply been carrying a small number of imperfect containers. Investigators noted the empty barrels because they could not establish with confidence why they were empty, but the presence of 9 empty red oak barrels among a much larger cargo of white oak ones suggested something less dramatic than deliberate extraction. The state of the ship instruments was also documented. The compass in the binnacle was damaged, its bowl displaced from its proper position, and this was noted as potentially significant, since a damaged compass aboard a ship at sea would be a source of immediate concern to any navigator. A captain who found his compass damaged might be more inclined to make conservative decisions, to slow down, to check his position by other means, to be cautious in ways that a captain with a functioning compass might not need to be. Whether the compass damage contributed to whatever decision the captain eventually made, if a decision was made, is not something the physical evidence can establish. The compass was simply found in that condition, displaced, part of the general picture of a ship that had been in full use and had then been left. The cabin that Captain Briggs shared with his wife and daughter was, by the accounts of the DEI Gratia salvage crew, in the condition of a cabin occupied by a family in the middle of a voyage. Clothing was present. The small personal things that a family brings on a long sea journey, the objects of daily comfort and routine, were present. The child's belongings were in the cabin. The crib where a 2-year-old would have slept was there, and the small personal effects that accompany a young child on any journey were stowed in the way they are stowed by adults who have developed habits around them. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been deliberately prepared for departure. A cabin with a child's things still in it speaks not to mystery in any dramatic sense, but to the simple fact of what leaving quickly means. When you are a family with a small child in the middle of an Atlantic crossing, gathering what you need for a small child takes time. It requires thinking. It requires making choices about what is essential and what can be left. The cabin of the Mary Celeste, with its child's belongings, still neatly stowed, suggested that whoever left the ship, if they left willingly, left without going through that process. Either they believed they would be back shortly, or they left in a hurry that did not allow for it, or something else happened that the physical evidence of the cabin does not resolve. The DEI Gracia salvage crew spent time documenting what they found aboard. They were experienced sailors, not investigators, and their interest in the ship was initially the interest of mariners who had encountered a vessel in distress and were calculating what could be done with it. The legal situation was understood. A ship found at sea with no crew and no indication that help was coming was a salvage opportunity, and the crew of the DEI Gratia were entitled to bring the Mary Celeste to port and file a claim. That claim would eventually be examined by a British Admiralty court in Gibraltar, and so the documentation the salvage crew produced would matter. What they reported was consistent: a ship in fair condition, carrying intact cargo, provisioned for an extended voyage, with personal effects undisturbed throughout, and one notable absence, which was the crew in the small boat that had been mounted on the main hatch. The Carol A. Deering, whose galley also attracted significant attention from investigators who boarded her in 1921, offered a slightly different version of the same basic picture. A meal had apparently been in preparation when the crew left, or when whatever happened, happened. Food was found on the stove in a state consistent with recent cooking. The galley showed evidence of activity that had been interrupted rather than concluded. If the Mary Celeste's galley had the quality of a place where work had recently finished, the Daring's galley had the quality of a place where work had stopped in the middle. Food prepared for a meal that was never served, a stove that had been in use, provisions that had not been taken. The two galleys, one suggesting recent completion of a task, one suggesting a task cut short, offer the same basic implication from slightly different angles. In neither case did the crew take food. In neither case did they take the provisions that would have sustained them over open water. In both cases, the galley stood as evidence of ordinary shipboard life proceeding normally up to the moment it stopped. What investigators across both cases kept returning to was the absence of signs of struggle or violence. Aboard the Mary Celeste, the stains that British Admiralty investigator Solly Flood had initially suspected might be blood were later determined, on chemical analysis, to be something else entirely, not blood, not evidence of violence. The surfaces of the ship, the deck, the railing, the interior spaces, did not carry the marks of a violent event. Aboard the Carroll A. Deering, similarly, no evidence of violence against persons was found. The ships had not been fought over. They had simply been left. The consistency of that pattern across different vessels, different oceans, different decades, is one of the things that makes ghost ship cases collectively interesting. The abandonment in each documented case appears to have been orderly enough that the ship itself was not harmed in the leaving. The holds were undamaged. The structures were intact. The objects inside were in their ordinary positions. Whatever had driven people off these ships had done so without tearing the ships apart in the process. The ships were left behind in the condition of things that have been stepped away from, not the condition of things that have been fought over or fled from in panic. The sails of the Carroll A. Deering were set, not all of them, and not in perfect order, but set in a manner that suggested the ship had been underway rather than anchored when the crew left. A ship at anchor, abandoned, looks different from a ship under sail, abandoned. The Deering was found aground, which meant she had been moving, and moving with sail set, and had run onto the shoals without anyone at the helm to prevent it. The progression of events that the physical state of the Deering implied, crew gone, sails partially set, ship moving without guidance, eventual grounding on Diamond Shoals, was a progression that the evidence supported without fully explaining. The red distress lights still rigged in the Deering's rigging when she was found were in that context particularly specific. A distress signal rigged in the rigging is not an automatic system. It requires hands to place it. Someone had deliberately rigged the signal, which meant someone aboard the Deering had, at some point between the crew's disappearance and the ship's grounding, or perhaps before whatever happened, prepared a visible distress indication. The lights were not burning when the Deering was found, but they were in place, set by someone who understood what they were for, and had put them where they would be seen. Whether the lights were rigged before or after the crew disappeared, and by whom, is not something the physical evidence resolves. They were simply there, hanging in the rigging of a ship that no longer had anyone aboard to tend them. Distress signals and logs and pipes on cabin surfaces and boots beside bunks and barrels of intact cargo in a sealed hold and a child's belongings stowed neatly in a family cabin. These are the things that ghost ship investigations are built from. They are plain, physical, specific objects, each in a particular place, each in a particular condition, each telling something limited and honest about what happened before investigators arrived. Taken together, they build a picture of ordinary life aboard a vessel proceeding normally up to the point where it stopped. They do not build a picture of catastrophe or of violence or of panic. They build a picture of departure. The yawl boat from the Mary Celeste was not a large vessel. A yawl of the type that would have been mounted on the main hatch of a brigantine in 1872 was a small working boat, useful for ferrying people to and from shore, useful for short-range work around the hull of a larger vessel, not designed for extended open ocean travel. A boat of that type, carrying 10 people, would have been low in the water. It would have been manageable in calm conditions and difficult in rough ones. The Atlantic in late November and early December is not reliably calm. 10 people in a small open boat on the Atlantic, with no record of their having been found and no wreckage of the boat ever recovered, is not a mystery in the same sense that the ship's condition is a mystery. The ocean's capacity for absorbing small wooden vessels without trace is substantial and well documented. What makes the yawl's absence from the record interesting is not that it disappeared. Small boats in the open Atlantic disappear with a regularity that maritime records confirm, but that it took with it everyone who had been aboard one of the most carefully preserved and fully provisioned vessels ever found, drifting without a crew. The Mary Celeste herself sailed on, under the management of the DEI Gratia salvage crew, across the remaining miles to Gibraltar. She arrived in fair condition. The cargo was assessed. The courts examined the claim. The ship that had been found moving through the Atlantic under sail, with her provisions intact and her log entry 9 days old, and her main hatch brackets empty of the small boat that had once sat on them, was real enough to be valued, tried, and awarded at law. Whatever had happened in those 9 days between November 25th and December 4th, the ship itself remained as evidence that something had happened, solid, seaworthy, and entirely unable to say what. Somewhere on the Atlantic, between the Azores and the point where the DEI Gratia first spotted her, the Mary Celeste had been a crude vessel with a family aboard and a cook working in the galley, and a captain writing in the log, and sailors sleeping in the bunks where their boots stood in pairs beside the frames. Then it had been something else. The transition between those two states is precisely what the evidence does not illuminate, and what it does illuminate: the intact provisions, the stocked galley, the undisturbed personal effects, the final log entry in a steady hand. The empty brackets on the main hatch remains clear and specific and open, like a record that ends mid-sentence, the pen still wet, the next page blank. The empty brackets on the Mary Celeste's main hatch are worth returning to one final time, because they are in some ways the most concrete thing in the case. Everything else aboard the ship speaks to presence, the presence of provisions, of cargo, of personal effects, of the ordinary material of 10 people's lives in the middle of a voyage. The brackets speak to absence in a way that can be measured. The boat was mounted there. It is gone. The wood around the brackets carries the marks of its removal. The Atlantic beyond the hatch offers no record of where it went. A small boat, 10 people, and the open ocean in the last days of November 1872, and from that point forward only the brackets, the scuffed wood, and the wide gray water visible through the open deck around them, extending outward in every direction, holding nothing that was asked of it, still and broad and without answer, as it has remained ever since. A waterspout, seen from the deck of a ship, looks different from how it looks in any illustration. The drawings show a neat column of water connecting cloud to sea, symmetrical and still, as though someone has set it there for reference. The real thing moves, it rotates. Its lower edge shifts across the water's surface in a dragging, wandering path that follows no obvious direction, and the sound it produces, a low, sustained rush of air and water moving together, carries across open ocean before the column itself is close enough to make out clearly. From a quarter-mile away, with no land visible in any direction, a water spout in the path of a sailing vessel would be large enough to fill the forward view entirely. It would be, in the plain and practical sense, an event that required a decision. The Atlantic near the Azores in late November is not a gentle stretch of water. The weather systems that move through that region in autumn carry sustained winds, heavy swells, and low cloud cover that compresses the visible horizon to a short distance in every direction. A ship encountering a waterspout in those conditions would have limited time to judge the column's true track, limited visibility to read the weather around it, and a captain who would need to weigh his options without the kind of information that takes hours to gather. Whether the waterspout moved toward the ship or parallel to it, whether it was growing or collapsing, whether the hull was in genuine danger, none of these things would be immediately clear. What would be clear is that the column was there, that it was large, and that the sea around it was behaving in a way the sea does not ordinarily behave. This is one of the more quietly plausible suggestions offered for what might have driven the crew of the Mary Celeste off their ship on or around November 25th, 1872, 9 days before she was found sailing herself across the Atlantic with no one aboard. The waterspout hypothesis does not require any malice or misfortune or mechanical failure. It requires only that a weather event, seen from close range in poor conditions, looked dangerous enough to prompt the captain to order the yawl boat launched, the crew into it, and a tow line paid out behind the ship so that they could be pulled back aboard once the weather column had passed. And then, some variant of the line parting, the wind picking up, the ship pulling away, the small boat and its 10 occupants finding themselves adrift, while the Mary Celeste continued sailing, quite competently, toward the Azores without them. The appeal of this explanation is partly in how well it matches the physical evidence. The ship was not damaged. Her cargo was intact. Her sails, though not perfectly set, were not in ruins. Nothing aboard suggested a disaster had taken place on the ship itself. Whatever sent the crew into the water did not come from the Mary Celeste. It came from outside her, and the waterspout fits that shape. The liability of the hypothesis, of course, is that it explains the crew's departure from the ship without being able to explain why no one ever found any of them or any wreckage of the small boat they left in. The seaquake theory approaches the problem from a different direction. Underwater earthquakes in the Atlantic are not unusual. The geological activity around the mid-Atlantic ridge and the Azores archipelago in particular produces submarine tremors with some regularity, and a seaquake of moderate intensity felt through the hull of a wooden sailing ship would be a genuinely disorienting experience. The sensation of a seaquake transmitted through a hull is described by those who have experienced one as a sudden violent shuddering, like the ship striking something solid beneath the water at full speed, followed by a rolling vibration that moves through the deck and the masts and everything aboard. It does not feel from inside the ship like an earthquake. It feels like the ship is breaking. The hypothesis holds that the Mary Celeste, sailing near the Azores around November 25th, may have passed over or near the epicenter of an underwater seismic event strong enough to produce this effect without causing structural damage to the hull. What it would have caused, the argument goes, is the very reasonable impression that the ship had struck something and was about to founder. A captain who believed his ship was sinking would not send his crew below to investigate. He would get them into the survival craft and off the vessel as fast as could be managed, possibly trailing a line back to the ship in the hope of reboarding her once the situation became clearer. And then, as with the waterspout scenario, the line parts or the wind shifts and the Mary Celeste sails on alone. These two explanations share a common structure. They both propose that the crew left the Mary Celeste not because something destroyed the ship, but because something convinced them, briefly and incorrectly, that the ship was about to be destroyed. The ship was fine. They were not. The tragedy, in either version, is not that the vessel failed, but that the information available to the people aboard her, in that moment, did not match the actual condition of the hull. The ocean is a place where the gap between what appears to be happening and what is actually happening can, in specific circumstances, be very wide. The third natural explanation that maritime researchers have spent considerable effort examining involves the cargo. The Mary Celeste was carrying approximately 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol when she sailed from New York, and 9 of those barrels were found empty when the ship reached Gibraltar. The nature of commercial alcohol at this time, its storage in wooden barrels that expand and contract with changes in temperature and pressure, its tendency to produce vapor that is heavier than air and accumulates in enclosed spaces, means that in the right conditions, a significant quantity of flammable gas could build up in the hold without anyone on the upper decks being aware of it. The hatches, when opened, would create a shift in pressure. That shift might discharge the accumulated vapor rapidly and visibly, not as an explosion, not as a fire, but as a sudden rush of gas out through the hatch opening, dramatic enough to resemble the initial stage of something catastrophic. Picture the hold of the ship sealed tight through a cold night's sailing, the temperature below deck different from the temperature above, the barrels that were the most compromised seeping their contents slowly into the dark air of the cargo space. By morning, the concentration of alcohol vapor in the closed hold would have risen significantly. When the hatch is opened by the captain or a crew member tasked with checking the cargo, the pressure difference sends a visible, forceful breath of gas up through the opening. It does not catch fire. There is no flame, no explosion, but the sound and the pressure and the smell of it, concentrated and sudden, might reasonably be interpreted by anyone standing near that hatch as the precursor to a catastrophic fire. And on a wooden sailing ship carrying over 1,000 barrels of alcohol, a fire is not a recoverable situation. It is the kind of threat that justifies immediate evacuation. This explanation has the additional practical advantage of accounting for the empty barrels. 9 barrels drained or seeping would produce a meaningful volume of vapor in an enclosed space. The remaining 1,692 barrels were intact and sealed, which is consistent with a hold where only a portion of the cargo had degraded sufficiently to leak. It is also consistent with a scenario in which no explosion actually occurred, because what actually occurred was the vapor releasing harmlessly into the air above the open hatch and then dispersing. The ship, again, was fine. The alarm was real. The danger, as measured after the fact, was not. None of these 3 explanations, the water spout, the seaquake, the vapor discharge, has been established as the definitive account of what happened on the Mary Celeste in the last days of November 1872. Each of them has advocates among maritime researchers and historians, and each of them has the virtue of requiring no extraordinary events, only ordinary maritime conditions, seen at a moment when ordinary conditions were enough to tip the balance of a reasonable person's judgment toward evacuation. What they share, beyond their structural similarities, is a kind of considered modesty. They propose that something went wrong in a way that left no evidence on the ship, because what went wrong was the decision made by the people on it, a decision that made perfect sense given what they could see, and that turned out, given what we can see now from a century and a half of distance, to have been unnecessary. The investigation that followed the Mary Celeste's arrival in Gibraltar was less inclined toward modesty. The British Admiralty's chief investigator, Solly Flood, approached the case with the settled conviction that something criminal had taken place. Flood was, by the accounts of those who worked around him, a man with a strong preference for explanations that involved human wrongdoing, and the Mary Celeste presented him with enough surface ambiguity to sustain almost any theory he chose to bring to it. His primary suspicion fell on the crew of the DEI Gratia, the Canadian brigantine, whose crew had found the Mary Celeste, boarded her, and sailed her into Gibraltar, claiming salvage rights. To Flood, the convenient timing of the discovery and the financial incentive of the salvage claim looked like the outlines of a conspiracy. He commissioned chemical analysis of stains found on the railing of the Mary Celeste. The stains, Flood was certain, were blood. The analysis was performed by a Dr. J. Patron, who concluded that the substance was in fact not blood at all, that the staining was consistent with vegetable matter or iron rust, and that no human blood was present in the samples. Flood received this result with marked reluctance. His written correspondence from the period suggests that he found the laboratory findings inconvenient rather than settling, and he continued to develop his theory of foul play even as the chemical evidence against it accumulated. The marks on a sword or knife found aboard the ship he interpreted as evidence of violence. Subsequent examiners concluded they were consistent with ordinary rust. What the Flood investigation illustrates from the comfortable distance of a century and a half is not primarily the question of what happened to the Mary Celeste's crew. It illustrates something about the way a theory, once formed, shapes the evidence it encounters. Flood looked at the Mary Celeste and saw a crime scene. Every ambiguous detail became a clue, pointing toward the crime he had already decided had been committed. The empty barrels became evidence of a drinking crew. The missing yawl boat became evidence of a planned escape. The log entry with no mention of trouble became suspicious silence rather than plain notation. The DEI Gratia crew, who had behaved throughout with straightforward and documented professionalism, became suspects whose cooperation with investigators was itself somehow incriminating. The court in Gibraltar, after reviewing Flood's arguments and the physical evidence, awarded the DEI Gratia crew a reduced salvage grant, not because the court accepted Flood's theory of foul play, but because the circumstances surrounding the abandonment remained unexplained, and the court was not prepared to fully exonerate anyone while the mystery was unresolved. The suspicion cast by Flood's investigation followed the DEI Gratia's captain and crew for years, which is perhaps the most concretely unfortunate outcome of an inquiry whose central thesis was never established. Insurance fraud was considered seriously in the Mary Celeste case, and to a lesser degree in other abandoned vessel investigations of the period. The theory is straightforward in outline. A shipowner arranges for a vessel to be abandoned or destroyed, claims the insurance value, and walks away from a cargo or ship that had become a financial liability. Lloyd's of London, which underwritten significant maritime insurance throughout this period, maintained its own investigators who examined cases of suspicious abandonment, and their records document genuine instances of staged maritime loss during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The practice was real enough and documented well enough that treating it as a serious possibility in any unexplained abandonment was reasonable professional caution rather than ungrounded suspicion. In the Mary Celeste case, however, the insurance fraud theory runs into practical difficulties. Captain Benjamin Briggs was, by all available accounts, a careful, experienced, and professionally well-regarded master mariner. He had brought his wife and 2-year-old daughter aboard for the voyage, not the typical behavior of a man planning to disappear. The ship owner, James Winchester, held only a partial interest in the cargo and stood to gain less from the insurance payment than he stood to lose from the reputational damage of a fraud investigation. The cargo of commercial alcohol was valuable, but not extraordinarily so. The fraud theory requires a conspiracy of at least 10 people, none of whom subsequently surfaced in any form, none of whom left any trace in the financial or personal records that investigators examined over the following decades. This does not make fraud impossible, but it makes it cumbersome as an explanation. Too many moving parts, too many people who would need to stay silent forever. There is also the simple matter of what the ship looked like when the DEI Gratia found her. A vessel prepared for deliberate abandonment would typically have the appearance of deliberate abandonment. The Mary Celeste had the appearance of a ship whose crew had left in a hurry, without preparation, taking almost nothing that they would have chosen to take if they had known they would not be coming back. This is a distinction that Flood, in his focus on the conspiracy he had already constructed, did not find useful to dwell on. The theories that surrounded other ghost ship cases of later decades drew on the accumulated mythology of the Mary Celeste, even when the circumstances were quite different. The Carol A. Deering found aground on Diamond Shoals in January of 1921, with all 11 crew members missing and the ship in good general condition, attracted its own cluster of explanations ranging from mutiny to piracy, to rum running gone wrong, to the brief but earnest suggestion, in some quarters, of intervention by something beyond ordinary accounting. The U.S. government's investigation, which involved the State Department, the Commerce Department, the Navy, and the Treasury Department's Division of Investigation, examined the Deering case for over 3 years and concluded without any definitive answer. The rum-running hypothesis had some circumstantial appeal, given the year and the location and the coastal geography of the Outer Banks in the early years of Prohibition. But it was never established with documentary evidence. Mutiny among the Deering's crew was considered a plausible alternative. The ship had experienced crew tensions during the voyage. The original captain had fallen ill and been replaced, and at least one crew member had reportedly threatened the new captain during a port call before the Deering's final passage. Whether that tension escalated into something that caused the disappearance of the entire complement is not something the investigation was able to determine. What the investigators found aboard: red distress lights still rigged, food prepared in the galley as though a meal had been interrupted, personal effects and sailors' pipes left behind, fit neither a planned mutiny departure nor an orderly abandonment particularly well. It fit, more than anything else, the specific texture of a situation that had developed faster than anyone had time to prepare for, whatever that situation was. The MV Joyita, found drifting and listing in the South Pacific in November of 1955, with all 25 passengers and crew members gone, produced a different set of explanations suited to its different circumstances. The Joyita had sailed from Samoa toward Tokelau, a passage of about 2 days, and had been overdue for nearly 5 weeks by the time she was found, empty and waterlogged, some 600 miles off her intended course. Her cork-insulated hull meant she could not sink even when heavily flooded, but this fact, which should have made her the safest possible vessel to remain aboard during a mechanical emergency, somehow did not prevent the departure of everyone on her. The life rafts were missing. The medical supplies showed signs of having been used. The radio was found tuned to the international distress frequency, but had apparently been transmitting on a damaged signal, likely too weak to have been received by anyone. The most developed explanation for the Joyita holds that a fuel line failure caused a flooding problem in the engine room. The radio damage prevented a distress call from being heard, and the captain, who was apparently injured based on evidence of bandaging materials found aboard, was incapacitated at a moment when his passengers were already in a state of acute anxiety. Whether a mass decision to abandon the Joyita was made, or whether people left in smaller groups over a period of hours, or whether the life rafts were launched to carry an injured person to shore while the rest of the ship was temporarily left aboard, is not established by the evidence. The ocean around the Joyhita's final position is wide, and the months between her disappearance and her discovery were enough to scatter anything that might have answered the question past the point of recovery. The Joyhita case attracted, as the Carol A. Gearing had before it, the suggestion that piracy was involved. The South Pacific in the mid-1950s was not the featureless expanse of safety that distance might suggest. There were active fishing and small cargo operations, isolated island communities, and the practical difficulties of maritime enforcement across enormous ocean distances. Whether pirates boarded the Joyita while she was disabled and took the passengers and crew, or whether the events were entirely internal to the ship and its failure, the investigation was not able to determine. The word piracy, in maritime context, tends to function as an explanation that fills the space where evidence does not reach, which is not to say it is wrong, only that it is comfortable in a way that documented conclusions are not. What all of these theories share, beyond their individual details, is a quality of reasonableness. They do not require the impossible. They require only a specific coincidence of ordinary maritime hazards, human decisions made with incomplete information, and the particular way that a ship, once left alone on open water, tends to keep going. Sailing vessels do not need crews to sail. Given a set sail, a workable rudder configuration, and a moderate wind, a ship can maintain a course for hours without anyone at the helm. The DEI Gratia crew, who boarded the Mary Celeste, found her in exactly this condition, not adrift in the true sense, not wallowing helplessly in the swells, but sailing with the functional competence of a vessel that had simply mislaid the people who were supposed to be making decisions aboard her. There is something in this fact that the theories all have to accommodate. The ship was not abandoned to the sea. She was abandoned to herself, and she managed. She sailed on. She did not sink or capsize, or run aground, or lose her masts. She continued. In the 9 days between the last log entry and her discovery by the DEI Gratia, to make progress generally eastward across the Atlantic, which is the direction she had been pointed when the crew left. This suggests that her sails and rigging were functioning at the time of abandonment, that the weather after the crew's departure was manageable, and that whatever caused the evacuation did not damage the ship's ability to sail. The theories all need to account for a vessel that was by every measurable standard still seaworthy, and they do. Each of them in its own way explains not a ship in distress, but a ship whose crew had reason to believe it was in distress, and acted accordingly. The human element in these cases is the piece that the theories can address only from outside. What it felt like to be Captain Briggs on the morning of whatever day it was when he made his decision, what the light was like, what the sound of the ship's hull was telling him, what his wife said, what the crew looked like when he called them on deck. This is not in the record. The record contains a log entry, a cargo manifest, a set of sails, some empty barrels, and the brackets on the main hatch where the yawl boat used to be. Everything else is the space that the theories inhabit, and they do so honestly, for the most part, not claiming to know what the record does not show, but proposing the shapes that would fit the outline left behind. The broader history of maritime investigation contains its share of cases that began as mysteries and ended with documented explanations. Vessels that appeared abandoned were found to have had navigational failures that caused the crew to misidentify their position, leading to an evacuation near land that was closer than it appeared. Ships found drifting with no crew were later traced to documented disasters whose survivors had been picked up by other vessels before the original ship was located. Fires that seemed to leave no evidence were explained by the way saltwater extinguishes and erases. The category of genuinely unresolved maritime disappearances, cases where investigation left no viable account of the departure of the crew, is smaller than the mythology of ghost ships might suggest. This does not make the Mary Celeste or the Carol A, Daring, or the Joyita less interesting. It makes them more precisely interesting. They belong to the smaller group, the cases where the investigation ran its full course and reached the boundary of what the evidence could support. They are not mysteries by default or by the absence of investigation. They are mysteries in spite of considerable and careful attention, and that is a more specific and more genuinely curious thing to be. What remains available to anyone thinking about these cases, from whatever comfortable distance the years provide, is the activity of weighing the explanations against the evidence that produced them. The waterspout near the Azores, the shudder through the hull that felt like the ship beginning to break, the sudden rush of vapor from an opened hatch on a cold November morning, alarming enough in the half second it took to register, to set in motion a chain of decisions that none of the 10 people in the yawl boat would have made if they could have seen, from 5 minutes in the future, that the ship behind them was fine. The satisfying and genuinely open quality of this kind of thinking is that it requires no conclusion. The cases are not waiting to be solved. They are waiting, as old things do, to be considered, turned over slowly, held up to the available light, and set back down with the acknowledgement that some of what happened on the Atlantic in late November of 1872 will simply remain on the Atlantic, in the particular depth of water, where the 9 days between the last log entry and the DEI Gratia's approach have settled and stayed. The explanations are not failures, because none of them has been confirmed. The conditions that produce the waterspout theory are real. Atlantic weather near the Azores in late autumn is documented and consistent with everything the hypothesis requires. The geological conditions that produce seaquakes in that region are real and measured. The chemistry of alcohol vapor in an enclosed hold is not in question. Each theory is built from materials that exist in the world, arranged in a configuration that fits the shape of what was found. The fact that none of them can be confirmed is in its own way a statement about the limits of what evidence survives on open water over a century and a half, not a statement about the plausibility of the explanations themselves. The Mary Celeste's cargo hold, in this sense, is a particularly good place to let the mind rest. It is dark in there, in any reconstruction, because the only light comes from the hatch above, and if the hatch is closed, the hold is as dark as the inside of anything closed, and old, and below the waterline. The barrels are stacked and secured, most of them sealed, 9 of them compromised, in ways that seep slowly into the air of the space around them. The temperature is cooler than the deck above. The smell is particular, the sweet, sharp, medicinal smell of commercial-grade alcohol in a wooden container, mixed with the older smell of bilge and oak and salt water absorbed into every surface of the ship over years of working the North Atlantic trade routes. In that hold, in late November of 1872, something was accumulating that could not be seen. Whether it was enough to change the outcome of the voyage, whether the vapor rose to a concentration that alarmed the captain, whether the hatch was opened at exactly the wrong moment, and whether the rush of gas out through the opening looked, from the deck, like the beginning of something that was not going to stop, is not established by the sealed barrels that remained when the DEI Gracia crew went below to check the cargo. What the sealed barrels establish is that the hold was not a disaster. What they cannot establish is what the hold looked and felt and smelled like when someone first opened the hatch in the specific moment when the decision that changed everything was being made. The 9 empty barrels were the ones that had already spent themselves. The rest were waiting, sealed and quiet, in a dark space below a ship that continued to sail east toward an Italian port, where a cargo was expected and a delivery had been arranged, and where no one arrived. The most ordinary explanation for a mystery is not always the right one, but it is usually the one most worth sitting with, because ordinary explanations are built from the same materials as ordinary life, and ordinary life is what produces, most of the time, even the most unusual outcomes. A water spout on the horizon, a shudder through the hull, a rush of gas from an opened hatch, a captain making a decision he believed was correct in the specific conditions of a November morning on the Atlantic, with the information available to him in the time he had, and then the sea, doing what the sea does, holding the question open without commentary for as long as anyone continues to ask it. The 3 men who boarded the Mary Celeste from the DEI Gratia on the afternoon of December 4th, 1872, knew before they crossed the rail that whatever they were stepping into, they would need to be ready to account for every detail of it, not because they were curious, though they were, because they had a legal claim to make, a court to face, and a story to tell that would need to hold up under examination by men whose profession was finding the places where stories came apart. Oliver DeVoe was the chief mate of the DEI Gratia, and it was DeVoe who led the small party across to the drifting brigantine. He had been watching the ship from a distance for some time before the boarding, long enough to be reasonably certain there was no one aboard, and long enough to begin thinking about what it would take to sail her. The Mary Celeste was a working vessel in reasonable condition, her cargo intact as far as anyone could tell from the outside, her hull sound. Under the rules that governed such situations, she and everything aboard her represented a legal prize. But the rules also required the salvage crew to be careful, to document what they found, to handle the ship properly, and to bring her into a port of authority where the claim could be assessed. A ship simply taken and sold would not be a salvage, it would be something else, and DeVoe understood the difference. What DeVoe and his 2 men faced on the crossing between the ships, with the Atlantic running its particular gray in December and the wind carrying enough edge to make the work physical, was the practical problem of managing an unfamiliar vessel short-handed. The Mary Celeste had a crew of 8 under normal circumstances. 3 men would have to account for everything her regular crew had handled between them, set what sails they could manage, and navigate her roughly 600 miles to Gibraltar. This was not a small undertaking. These were experienced seamen, capable of handling more than most people could. But the Mary Celeste was a brigantine, rigged differently from the DEI Gratia, and the passage ahead of them was not the kind of thing a man would agree to if he had easier options. DeVoe agreed to it. He made the practical calculations a sailor makes, the wind direction, the distance, the state of the ship, the size of the award if the claim held, and he agreed. 2 other crew members from the DEI Gratia came with him. Captain Morehouse of the DEI Gratia, short-handed now himself, watched them go and set his own course for Gibraltar by a different route, arriving before them as it happened, which gave him time to report the situation to the authorities before DeVoe's party came into port with the prize. The sail to Gibraltar took DeVoe's small crew several days. The weather was not kind to them. The Mary Celeste, rigged for a full crew, was a challenge to manage with 3, and they worked the ship in shifts that left little room for anything except what the sailing required. By the time they brought her into Gibraltar Harbor, they were tired, and the situation awaiting them was not the simple administrative matter a clean salvage might have been, because Captain Morehouse had arrived first, and because the story of a crewless ship found drifting in the Atlantic in perfectly good condition, with no distress signal, no log entry explaining an evacuation, and a cargo fully intact, was not a story that the Gibraltar authorities found simple to accept at face value. Solly Flood was the Attorney General for Gibraltar and the Queen's Proctor in Admiralty, and he was the man tasked with examining the circumstances of the Mary Celeste's abandonment. His role put him in the position of official investigator, and the role suited him. He was thorough, opinionated, and genuinely convinced from an early stage that something criminal had occurred. What he examined was the ship, the cargo, the documentation, and the two crews, the DEI Gratia crew, who had found and sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, and the 7 men from the Mary Celeste, who, not having been aboard the ship when it was found, were not present to answer questions at all. The proceeding that followed in the Vice Admiralty Court of Gibraltar was not a criminal trial, but it had the character of one in certain respects. Flood's suspicions centered on the DEI Gratia crew. The theory, as he developed it, was that something violent had occurred between the two ships, that the crews had been in contact, that there had been a confrontation, and that the Mary Celeste's crew had come to harm at the hands of the men who now claimed to have found the vessel abandoned. He commissioned chemical analysis of stains found on the ship's railing and on a sword discovered in the captain's cabin. The testing returned the conclusion that the stains were not human blood. Flood disputed this finding. He remained committed to his position even as the evidence declined to support it. This is one of the things that maritime legal proceedings sometimes produce: a determined official and an inconclusive record, each refusing to fully release the other. The court did not sustain Flood's theory of foul play, but his suspicion was enough to affect the outcome for the DEI Gratia crew in a way that the law made perfectly legible. Under Admiralty law, a successful salvage claim entitled the salvors to a portion of the value of the vessel and cargo they had preserved. The Mary Celeste was valued at around £6,000 for the ship and her cargo combined, a significant sum, and one the DEI Gratia crew had earned through genuine skill and effort in sailing an unfamiliar, short-handed vessel through several days of difficult Atlantic weather. The award the court granted them was approximately £1,700. This was not nothing. It was also considerably less than what a fully credited salvage award on a £6,000 ship and cargo would ordinarily produce. The reduction was not accidental. It reflected the court's residual suspicion, not proven, not dismissed, but present enough to affect the numbers on the page of the final judgment. Dejeveau and the others accepted the award. There was no practical alternative. The court had spoken, Flood had done his work, and the men who had sailed the Mary Celeste across hundreds of miles of winter Atlantic walked away with a fraction of what the effort was worth by any ordinary measure. The record of the proceeding went into the files of the Vice Admiralty Court, and the Mary Celeste was eventually released and returned to her owners and went back to sea under new management. The legal framework that surrounded the Mary Celeste case was not designed specifically for ghost ships. It was designed for the sea in general, for the constant possibility that vessels would be lost, damaged, found, and disputed, and that the law would need to be able to say clearly who owned what, who owed what to whom, and what obligations one sailor carried toward another when things went wrong on open water. Maritime law is old in this respect. It is older than most of the countries whose courts apply it. Its principles were being worked out by Phoenician traders and Roman jurists long before anyone had built a vessel remotely like the Mary Celeste, and what accumulated over those centuries was a body of rules that had been tested against almost every situation the sea could produce: storm, mutiny, piracy, grounding, collision, plague, fire, abandonment, and had been gradually shaped into something that could handle most of them. The doctrine of salvage is one of the clearest examples of how that accumulated wisdom works. A ship is a valuable thing, and a ship in danger is a situation where the right response is not always obvious. The law could have said that any ship found without crew is forfeit to the finder, but that would create an incentive to let ships drift rather than to rescue their crews, since a crewless ship is easier to claim than a crewed one. It could have said that found ships belong entirely to their original owners, regardless of the circumstances, but that would give salvors no reason to risk their lives, bringing a drifting vessel to safety, and a great many ships would simply be lost that might otherwise be recovered. What the law settled on instead was a framework designed to balance these pressures. The finder has a legitimate claim, proportional to the danger and difficulty of what they did, and the owner retains a right, but the finder must prove they genuinely saved the vessel, and must account fully for everything aboard it. A vessel becomes legally derelict, not simply because it is empty, or because its crew is gone, but because its owner has genuinely given up on recovering it, has ceased all efforts, relinquished all hope, and moved on in a way that the law can recognize as final. This is a higher bar than it might sound. Courts have historically required real demonstration of this intent, not merely the passage of time or the absence of the crew. An owner who has sent out search parties, filed insurance claims, and maintained a public position that the ship might yet be found, has not, in the legal sense, abandoned the vessel, even if the vessel is on the floor of the Atlantic and has been for a decade. The legal abandonment and the physical state of the ship can be, and often are, quite different things. This distinction matters because it affects who has the right to do what. A ship that is merely drifting, with owners still hoping to recover it, is not legally available for a clean salvage in the way a truly derelict vessel would be. The Dei Gratia cruise situation with the Mary Celeste illustrated this clearly. The ship's owners were very much still present and interested. The cargo belonged to people who expected to be paid. The crew might still be alive somewhere, for all anyone initially knew. DeVoe's claim was a salvage claim, not a dereliction claim, and it required him to account for everything aboard and to demonstrate that he had genuinely saved the vessel from a loss that would otherwise have occurred, not simply found a ship someone had misplaced. The law around abandonment of a vessel by its own crew is similarly careful and similarly old. A captain who orders his crew to abandon ship is not doing something simple. He is exercising a specific legal authority under conditions the law defines quite precisely. The circumstances that justify abandonment are not matters of personal preference or general fear. They are imminent sinking, uncontrollable fire, or catastrophic structural failure, the kinds of situations where remaining aboard offers no prospect of survival. A captain who orders abandonment outside these conditions and who loses cargo or causes harm by doing so faces real legal consequences. Negligence charges are possible. In cases where crew members or passengers are lost as a result of an unjustified evacuation, the potential liability is more serious still. This weight is part of why the figure of the captain carries the particular gravity it does in maritime culture and law. The law does not simply suggest that a captain should be responsible for his vessel and people. It requires it. The captain's authority aboard a ship is as close to absolute as civilian authority gets in the modern world, a consequence of the practical reality that a vessel at sea is effectively its own jurisdiction, beyond the reach of courts and police and emergency services, and that someone must have the final say in situations where indecision or divided authority can cost lives. The captain carries that authority, and the law keeps both sides of the bargain. It grants the captain wide power and holds the captain accountable for how that power is used. The duty to render assistance is the other side of this coin. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, as it is known in the shipping industry, formalizes obligations that were already embedded in maritime culture long before the convention existed. A vessel that receives a distress signal from another ship is not free to ignore it. If assistance can be rendered without serious danger to the responding vessel and her crew, the law requires that it be given. This is not a suggestion. It is a legal obligation enforceable in the courts of the nations that have signed the convention, which includes essentially every seafaring nation in the world. The distress signal itself is standardized, and this standardization is one of the quieter achievements of international maritime cooperation. When a vessel in genuine distress fires a flare, broadcasts a radio signal, or runs up the appropriate flags, the message she sends is the same regardless of what language the crew speaks, what flag she sails under, or what ocean she is crossing. A Norwegian cargo vessel and a Greek passenger ferry and a Japanese research ship all know what a solace distress signal means, and all carry the same legal obligation when they receive one. This was not always the case. The history of maritime law is partly the history of building toward exactly this kind of clarity, through decades of international negotiation and adjustment after situations where the absence of common signals cost lives. The Carol A. Deering, found aground off Cape Hatteras in January of 1921, had red distress lights rigged in her rigging when investigators came aboard. The lights were there, visible from a distance, hung in the place a crew in trouble would hang them. No signal had reached the shore. No distress call had been received. The lights were a visual signal only, of the older kind, the kind a ship would use before radio was standard equipment aboard commercial vessels, and they sat in the Deering's rigging as a sign that someone had, at some point, understood that the ship needed help, and had done the thing that maritime practice said to do when help was needed. What came of it, given that the ship was found hard aground and empty, is part of what made the Deering's case so difficult to account for in the official investigations that followed. The 5 federal agencies that examined the Carol A. Deering case over the years after her discovery, including the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the Justice Department, were operating within exactly the framework that maritime law provides for such situations. Ghost ship cases are not simply historical curiosities to the institutions that examine them. They are legal problems, insurance problems, diplomatic problems in some cases, and practical problems for the port authorities who have to decide what to do with a vessel that has arrived without the people who are supposed to bring her in. The law has procedures for all of these outcomes. The procedures are not always fully satisfying, as the Deering investigation and the Mary Celeste proceedings both illustrate, but they are serious attempts to give a legal account of situations that resist easy explanation. A captain standing at the rail in heavy weather, running through the considerations that the law and his training and his own judgment require him to weigh, is doing something that looks like private deliberation, but is in fact deeply embedded in a public framework. The question of whether the ship can be saved is not simply a question about the ship. It is a question about the cargo, the crew, the owners, the insurers, the port the ship was bound for, and the law of the nation whose court will eventually have to decide whether what the captain decided was correct. A captain with a sinking ship and a full crew as roughly the time it takes for the water to come up to the rail to make a decision that maritime courts might spend months or years examining afterward. This is part of what gives the Mary Celeste her particular place in the history of maritime law, beyond the mystery of what happened to her crew. She was a ship found in a condition that the law had clear procedures for handling, and those procedures were followed with care. Documents were filed, inspections were conducted, experts were consulted, chemical analyses were commissioned, a court heard arguments and issued a ruling, an award was granted, the ship was released. All of it went into the record. And the record, which is extensive and still available to researchers, contains both the answer to every procedural question and no answer at all to the central one. The award to the DEI Gratia crew, £1,700, entered into the court ledger against the name Mary Celeste, with the full assessed value of ship and cargo noted in a separate column, is in some ways the most legible thing about the entire episode. Numbers entered into a legal ledger have a clarity that witness accounts and forensic findings do not always share. The figure is specific. The reasoning behind it is documented. The disparity between the award and the full value is explained in the record by the court's position on the circumstances of the salvage. Whatever one makes of that position, and maritime historians have made quite a lot of it over the years, the entry itself is as plain as any record gets. What the ledger entry does not say is anything about the 10 people who were aboard the Mary Celeste when she left New York in November of 1872, and who were not aboard her when she arrived in Gibraltar in December. The law's accounting of the Mary Celeste case is thorough on the questions the law knows how to ask, and silent on the one it does not. This is not a failure of the law exactly. It is simply the edge of what any legal framework can do. Maritime law was built to handle the sea's ordinary disasters, the groundings and fires and collisions and storms that take ships and crews with something approaching comprehensible cause. It handles ghost ships through the procedures it has for abandoned vessels, for salvage claims, for disputed circumstances, and for findings that cannot be fully established. What it cannot do is supply, from its own resources, an account of what happened on the open Atlantic between the last log entry and the moment the DEI Gratia crew came alongside. The people who built the legal structures that surrounded the Mary Celeste case, the Admiralty Court, the salvage doctrine, the distress signal protocols, the captain's legal duties, built them for the sea they knew, with the disasters they could imagine. They did not imagine a ship found in perfectly good condition, fully provisioned, with her cargo intact and her course still set for Genoa, missing only the people who were supposed to be sailing her. The law handled this situation with the tools it had, and the tools were not quite the right shape for the job. The award was smaller than it should have been. The investigation produced suspicion without evidence. The record closed without resolution. But the record closed, which is itself something. The legal apparatus of the Vice Admiralty Court of Gibraltar, of Solly Flood, and his chemical analyses, and his firm, and ultimately unsupported convictions, of Oliver Devoe and his 2 exhausted companions who had sailed an unfamiliar ship through December Atlantic weather on 3 men's worth of labor, all of it produced a record that went into a ledger and stayed there. The clerk who entered the final award in careful ink, noting the name of the ship and the figure of £1,700 and the larger figure of what the ship and her cargo were actually worth, was doing exactly the work the institution asked of him with the specific care that a legal document requires. The ink dried, the ledger was filed, the case was closed. Outside the courthouse, the Mary Celeste eventually went back to sea. She passed through a series of owners over the following years, her history following her, and was eventually run aground on a reef off Haiti in 1885 in what the insurance investigators of that incident suspected, and some evidence suggested, was a deliberate grounding. The ship that had come into Gibraltar crewless and unexplained in December of 1872 ended her life on a Haitian reef in a fire that her last captain appears to have started himself, for reasons the insurance records of that later case illuminate without entirely resolving. She was a ship that attracted complicated legal situations. This is perhaps the most consistent thing about her. What the legal proceedings around her two most famous situations share, the Gibraltar hearing of 1872 and the Haitian inquiry of 1885, is a quality of institutional seriousness that history sometimes strips away when it retells these events as pure mystery. The people who examined the Mary Celeste in Gibraltar were not performing curiosity. They were doing their jobs under real legal obligations with real professional consequences for getting it wrong. Solly Flood's persistent conviction that something criminal had occurred was not simply an eccentric personal theory. It was the position of a trained legal officer with a genuine responsibility to investigate, who looked at a situation that did not make obvious sense and applied the method his training gave him, even when the evidence declined to confirm his starting position. Oliver Devoe's decision to board the Mary Celeste and sail her to Gibraltar was similarly not an act of adventure or curiosity. It was a calculated professional decision made by a man who understood the law well enough to know what a salvage claim required, and experienced enough at sea to believe he could manage the crossing. That the court's reward for his calculation was considerably less than the calculation had suggested it might be is one of the minor practical ironies of the case. A man makes a sound professional judgment, carries it out successfully under difficult conditions, and receives less than half of what the success was worth because an official in Gibraltar had a theory he couldn't prove but wasn't prepared to abandon either. The rules the sea runs by, viewed from the inside of a specific case, have this quality. They are serious and careful and designed to function well under pressure, and they produce outcomes that are sometimes just, sometimes less than just, and occasionally both at once. The legal record of the Mary Celeste is a document of institutional care applied to an event that resisted the care it was given. The care was genuine. The record is real. The event at its center remains what it was when the DEI Gratia crew came alongside in December of 1872, a ship under sail with no one at the helm, her cargo secured for Genoa, the Atlantic running gray around her in the afternoon light. A ship's log records positions and weather and incidents and decisions. The Mary Celeste's log ran out 9 days before the DEI Gratia found her, with a position near the Azores recorded in a steady hand and nothing indicating that anything was about to change. The next page was blank. What the log cannot record is what came after the last entry, because the last entry was made by someone who believed, at the time of writing, that there would be further entries to follow. The legal record that the Gibraltar proceedings produced fills in a different kind of gap, not the gap in the ship's log, but the institutional gap that opens whenever a vessel arrives in port in a condition the port authorities were not expecting. Courts, clerks, investigators, and salvors all played their parts in the proceedings with something that looks, across the distance of a century and a half, like conscientious effort. The result was a ledger entry, the name of the ship, the figure of the award, and the larger figure of what the ship and cargo were worth. The name Mary Celeste sits in that ledger entry, in ink that has been dry for a very long time, beside the figure of 1,700 pounds, which was what the court determined DeVoe and his crew had earned for their December crossing. The full value of the ship and cargo, the figure from which the award was drawn, down by Flood's suspicion and the court's residual uncertainty, sits beside it in a separate column, patiently different. Two numbers in a court ledger, one smaller than the other, with the whole complicated weight of the case resting quietly in the space between them. The institutional record of how carefully the sea's institutions attended to a thing they could not ultimately explain. In the winter of 1884, a magazine arrived in the hands of its readers the way magazines did then, folded, slightly stiff, smelling of ink and paper and the cold that had been on the delivery boy's coat. The Cornhill magazine was a respectable London publication, the kind that ran fiction alongside essays and commentary, and the issue in question contained a story called J. Habakkuk Jephson's Statement. The title was not especially promising. The name was invented, but the voice that opened the piece was something else entirely. Steady, precise, specific in the way only a witness could be specific, setting down the facts of what had happened aboard a vessel called the Marie Celeste, with the measured calm of a man who had survived something and was recording it accurately for the benefit of those who had not been there. A reader opening the magazine in a chair by a winter fire would have had no particular reason, in the first paragraph, to suspect they were reading fiction. The details were too fine, the voice was too even, the tone had the quality of testimony rather than invention. Arthur Conan Doyle had not yet created the character that would make him famous, that would come 3 years later, but in J. Habakkuk Jephson's Statement, he was already doing something he would later become known for, constructing a world in such careful detail that the seams of its making disappeared entirely. He had taken a real case, a genuine maritime mystery that had been reported in newspapers and discussed in court documents for over a decade, and he had written himself into it so thoroughly that the fictional version began, almost immediately, to displace the historical one in the minds of people who read both. The name of the ship in his story was Marie Celeste, one letter different from the actual vessel. He invented a survivor. He invented a motive. He invented a circumstances that had never been part of the documented record, and because the documented record was itself so sparse and so genuinely unresolved, there was room in the public understanding of the case for his version to take up residence. The story was published anonymously, which helped. Without a name attached to it, readers had less reason to place it in the category of literature rather than testimony. Some of the early responses treated it as a factual account. The fictional details, the invented survivor, the renamed vessel, the explanation Doyle constructed for why the crew had left, were reported and repeated in subsequent articles about the real case as though they had been established by investigation rather than imagination. It is the kind of thing that happens when a convincing fiction meets a genuine gap in the record. The fiction fills the gap, and eventually the gap is forgotten, and what remains is the story. Conan Doyle was not writing carelessly. He was writing well, which is what created the confusion. His version of the Mary Celeste case felt more complete than the historical version because the historical version had no ending, and his did. It is a quality that good fiction has and historical records often do not. The quality of arriving somewhere, of the pieces fitting, of the question having an answer, even if the answer is dark. What the Cornhill magazine reader experienced in the winter of 1884 was the particular pleasure of a mystery resolved, and that pleasure was durable enough to carry the fictional resolution forward into decades of subsequent accounts, where it continued to be repeated and continued to blur. The genuine history of the Mary Celeste was not, of course, without its own strange satisfactions. The ship had been built in Nova Scotia at a place called Spencer's Island in 1861 and had been launched under the name Amazon. That first name did not stay with it. The vessel changed hands several times in its early years, accumulating a history of minor misfortunes and ownership transfers that ended with it being purchased at auction, refitted, renamed, and eventually placed under the command of Benjamin Briggs. The name change was recorded. The keel had been laid in the same bay that local people still see from their windows. The ship that became one of the most discussed maritime mysteries of the 19th century began as a piece of local construction, a commercial vessel built by people with practical intentions in a quiet part of the Canadian coast, and then went out into the world and became something that would be written about and argued over for the next 150 years. Spencer's Island still maintains a heritage site acknowledging the connection. It is a modest acknowledgement, the kind of local historical marker that stands at the edge of something much larger than the immediate landscape can contain. The bay is still there. The water is the same water, more or less, that surrounded the keel when it was first shaped and fitted. And the site does something that local heritage markers sometimes do remarkably well, which is simply to say, this is where that started. Not the mystery, the ship. Before the voyage, before the courts in Gibraltar, before Conan Doyle, before 100 newspaper accounts, before the legend had a shape at all, there was a piece of timber in a Nova Scotia shipyard, and people working on it with tools in the cold, making something seaworthy for ordinary commercial reasons. The heritage site at Spencer's Island keeps that part of the story in view. It marks the connection between a community and a vessel that was built there and then went away and became something the community's builders never anticipated it would become. It is the kind of cultural memory that requires a physical anchor to survive, a place people can visit, a plaque, a small building, the water visible from the shoreline, because without the anchor, the specific origin story dissolves into the general story. And the general story is mostly about the mystery rather than the construction, about the vanishing rather than the building. It is worth noticing how different those two things are. The people who built the Amazon in 1861 were solving a practical problem. They were constructing a vessel capable of carrying cargo across open water, and they were doing it with the materials and skills available to them in that particular place and time. The ship they produced was solid enough to survive more than 2 decades of active use, including the period when it was found crewless in the Atlantic and sailed by a salvage crew to Gibraltar, and then sold and worked again, and eventually lost to the sea in an ordinary final way. The vessel lasted. The practical work those Nova Scotia shipwrights did in 1861 lasted long enough for a story to grow around it that has not yet finished growing. Samuel Taylor Coleridge had published his poem about a ghost ship 83 years before Conan Doyle's story appeared in the Cornhill magazine, and the poem had done its own kind of work on the public imagination by then. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was first printed in 1798, and it drew on things Coleridge had read about, polar exploration, and the folklore that sailors had been carrying and trading with each other across centuries, stories about ships that moved without wind, crews that were not what they appeared to be, the particular dread of open water under strange light. Coleridge took those materials and shaped them into something of lasting formal beauty, and what he shaped them into included an image that has not gone away. The idea of a vessel proceeding under no visible power, its crew beyond the ordinary conditions of life, the ship itself neither wrecked nor safe. That image predates Coleridge. It predates the poem in the way that most of what poems are made from predates them. The image of a ghost ship, a vessel moving through water without a living crew, or with something aboard that is not the expected thing, appears in maritime folklore across many centuries and many seafaring cultures, and it appears there because open water is the kind of place where the imagination produces its own company. A sailor far from shore, in the early dark, watching a distant light that does not behave quite as a lantern should, is already in the territory where the ghost ship story lives. The story is the explanation that the darkness offers. The Flying Dutchman is the most documented version of this class of story in the Western maritime tradition. It is generally traced to the period when Dutch merchant fleets were among the most active in the world, the 17th century, when the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, operated trading routes that required rounding the Cape of Good Hope on a regular basis, and when the waters around that cape were well known to be among the most dangerous on any established route. The Cape produces weather that can change within a watch, and the seas around it have claimed enough vessels over the centuries that the seafarers who worked those waters developed a rich and specific tradition of warning stories. The Flying Dutchman was one of them. The details of the legend vary across its different recorded versions, but the consistent element is the idea of a captain too proud or too stubborn to turn back from a dangerous passage, condemned for that refusal to sail the Cape waters indefinitely without making port. Richard Wagner took the story and made it into an opera in 1843. The opera Der Fliegende Holländer opened in Dresden and brought the legend to a new kind of audience, seated in an opera house, watching the phantom ship arrive on stage in constructed darkness and sound. The story that had begun as a sailor's warning passed across watch changes and over meals in ship's forecastles and through harbor taverns, was now being performed for audiences who had perhaps never been farther out on open water than a river crossing, and who were receiving the ghost ship not as a cautionary framework for understanding dangerous weather, but as drama, as spectacle, as something to feel in the dark of a theater. The legend had changed its form. It had moved from practical maritime use, this is the story we tell to explain certain things about the sea, into something more abstract, which is art, which keeps things alive in a different way, without the practical function, but with its own persistence. The audiences who saw Wagner's opera in 1843 were not in general mariners. They were European city dwellers who knew the sea mostly from the things they had read about it, and what they were watching was already a layer removed from the original legend. Coleridge's poem had done something similar with different materials 45 years earlier. Conan Doyle's story would do it again 40 years after Wagner, with the specific advantage that it was written so close to the form of a factual account that the distance between legend and report was almost invisible. What all three of these works share is the way they participated in keeping the ghost ship as a persistent presence in the cultural imagination, not by preserving the historical facts, but by giving the imagination something to hold. The historical facts, when they exist, are kept somewhere else, in the reading rooms and archive storage areas of institutions like the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, and the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. There are collections of papers and documents and ledgers related to American maritime history that include materials connected to the cases that became the famous stories. These are not exciting places to describe. An archive reading room is a particular kind of quiet, the quiet of maintained temperature and low light, and the specific care that goes into handling old paper. The folders are labeled. The documents inside them are flat and fragile and exact. A researcher working through them finds the institutional record that the dramatic retellings draw on and depart from in equal measure. That record is what makes the difference between a legend and a documented case. The Mary Celeste, the Carol A, Deering, the Joyita, the Bechimo, These are not the Flying Dutchman. They are not Coleridge's ship. They are documented events with court records and official investigations, and in some cases surviving physical evidence, and the institution of the archive is what holds that distinction in place. The archive is what makes it possible to say, with confidence, this part of the story is what was actually found, and this other part is what Conan Doyle added, and this third part is what the newspapers assumed and then repeated until the assumption hardened into apparent fact. Without the archive, the layers collapse into each other, and the legend is all that remains. There is a particular figure in all of this worth pausing on, and that is the reader in 1884 who opened the Cornhill magazine and began reading J. Bulcook Jeffson's statement, without knowing who wrote it or that it was fiction. That reader was encountering something that was, for the first few pages at least, genuinely indistinguishable from testimony. The voice was correct, the details were plausible. The maritime knowledge embedded in the text was sufficient to pass the attention of someone who knew something about ships, and the subject, a vessel found crewless in the Atlantic, was a real event that had been in the newspapers and the courts and the public conversation for 12 years. The reader had no particular reason to suspend engagement with the text as fact, because the text offered nothing to suspend it on. What that reader experienced in those first pages was not so different from what a salvage crew member from the DEI Gratia would have experienced stepping aboard the Mary Celeste in December of 1872. Something real was present. The details were correct and physical, but the explanation for the central missing thing was not there, and the absence of it left a shape in the air that the mind reached out to fill. The DEI Gratia crew filled it with theories. The British Admiralty investigator filled it with suspicion. Conan Doyle filled it with fiction. The folklorists who wrote about ghost ships across the following decades filled it with pattern. This story is like these other stories. It belongs to this category of the unexplained thing that the sea occasionally produces. Every one of these responses is a kind of narrative, even the formal legal one. The mystery required a story because mysteries always do, and the quality of the specific mystery in the Mary Celeste case was such that none of the stories told about it have ever been definitively preferred over the others. That indeterminacy is part of what the literary and cultural afterlife of the case preserves. A mystery with a confirmed solution tends to become a historical event. Interesting, perhaps, but no longer generative, no longer available for the imagination to move through and furnish. The Mary Celeste remained generative for over 100 years because the solution did not come. The story stayed open, and an open story is, in a particular way, a more durable cultural object than a closed one, because every generation that encounters it can bring its own version of the investigation, its own preferred explanation, its own sense of what the available evidence suggests. The Spencer's Island Heritage Site is doing something related to what the Cornhill magazine story did, and what the opera did, and what the archive does, but it is doing it in a different register entirely. It is not telling a dramatic story. It is not constructing an explanation. It is marking a place and saying simply, this is where the thing that became the story began. Before it was a mystery, it was a ship. Before it was a ship, it was timber and labor and practical knowledge applied in a specific location to a specific material purpose. The heritage site keeps that beginning in view, which is its own kind of archival function, the preservation not of the exciting part, but of the ordinary part that the exciting part grew out of. There is something in that worth staying with. The Amazon was built at Spencer's Island in 1861 by people who were not thinking about mystery or legend or the long cultural life of maritime disaster. They were building a commercial vessel. They were doing what shipwrights do, which is applying skill to material in a way that produces something capable of carrying weight across open water. The ship they built was sound. It did what it was supposed to do for years before it became the thing it is remembered as. And then one November, it departed New York with a captain and his family and 7 crew members aboard, and it was found the following month, moving under sail in the Atlantic with no one visible at the helm, and the ordinary commercial story ended and the other story began. The bay at Spencer's Island held the ship before any of that. The water there is the same kind of water, cold, tidal, northern, indifferent, that is found all along that coast, and it has been going about its tidal business since before any ship was built there, and continues to do so now. The gravel on the beach shifts with the seasons. The light on the water in winter is low and gray and wide, the kind of light that does not change very quickly and does not attract attention to itself. When the tide goes out, the water pulls back from the beach with a long sound and leaves the stones wet and dark, and when it comes back, it covers them again, and the bay continues in the way bays do, without reference to the ships that were built along its edges or the stories those ships became. Coleridge's Mariner was condemned by his own action, the shooting of a creature that had meant no harm. The penalty was the voyage, the endless sailing, the dead crew, the ship moving through water under no ordinary power. The poem's resolution is not the end of the voyage, but the telling of it. The mariner compelled to repeat his account to those he meets, the story itself becoming the form of whatever redemption is available to him. It is, in that sense, about what stories do with experience that cannot be otherwise resolved. The experience is too large or too strange to simply close. It must be told and retold. The telling is the only available form of completion. The cases that prompted the long cultural engagement with ghost ships share something of that quality. They are not resolved, and they cannot be resolved now. The witnesses are gone, the physical evidence has been dispersed, or lost, or was never conclusive. The ships themselves are on the ocean floor, or have simply ceased to appear in any human record. What remains is the documentary material held in archives, the court records, the insurance assessments, the navigational logs, the newspaper accounts, the literary retellings, and the heritage markers at the places where some of these ships were built, or where they finally came to rest. All of it is the telling. The telling is what persists when the thing itself is gone. The Flying Dutchman appears in accounts that span from the 17th century to the 20th, cited or reported by sailors at the Cape of Good Hope across that entire period. And what those sightings have in common is not an actual ship, but the expectation of a certain kind of thing in a certain kind of place, under certain kinds of conditions. A storm, poor visibility. The Cape, the waters that have taken so many vessels. The legend provides a framework, and the framework is available to the imagination when the conditions are right, and the imagination produces what the framework has primed it to see. This is not the same as saying the sightings were false. It is saying that what people see in extreme conditions is shaped by what they already carry with them, the stories, the warnings, the accumulated folklore of their trade, and the ghost ship at the Cape is something the maritime tradition has been carrying for a very long time. Conan Doyle carried the Mary Celeste case into his fiction and changed its shape enough that the fictional shape persisted in memory alongside the historical one. Wagner carried the Dutch legend into his opera and gave it a new set of people who would hold it, the opera audience, the people who listen to opera, the people who know the title without having seen the work, people for whom the Flying Dutchman is now also music, not just weather and warning. Coleridge carried something older and less specific into his poem and gave it a form that has been in print continuously since 1798, which means there has not been a generation since then without access to that particular version of the ghost ship, that specific rendering of what a ship moving without a living crew looks and sounds like. All of this accumulation, the legend, the poem, the opera, the fiction, the archive, the heritage marker, the ongoing historical discussion is what happens when an event is genuinely interesting and genuinely unresolved and leaves behind enough material that the human tendency towards story has something to work with. The ghost ship is not a special category of cultural object. It is an example of something more general, which is what happens when a real gap in the record meets a persistent human need to understand the things that happen on open water, which is to say, the things that happen at the edge of the known, and the edge of the controlled, and the edge of what ordinary life can contain. The Spencer's Island Bay, at low tide, is a quiet place. The water has gone out, and the stones on the beach are dark with what the tide left on them, and the light is the kind of light that comes from a sky that has a long way to go before dark, but is not in any hurry to get there. There is no ship in the bay now. The ships that were built there over the years went out and went to whatever end ships go to, and what remains is the shore, and the water, and the sky above both of them, and the ordinary continuing work of tides, which are not interested in what was built along the edges of the bay, or what those constructions became, or what stories followed them out into the world. The keel of the Amazon was laid in that bay in 1861, shaped and fitted by people whose names are in no document that most people will ever read, working on a ship that would eventually carry a name they never gave it into an event they did not foresee. The ship left the bay and entered the Atlantic trade routes and changed hands and changed its name and was eventually found drifting and became a story and became a mystery and became the subject of a fictional account that confused the historical record and became a heritage site back where it started. And the bay received none of this. The bay continued its own business, which is older and less complicated than any of that. On a gray afternoon on that shore, with the water pulled back from the gravel and the light low, and even across the surface of the bay, the place where the keel was laid is not obvious. The water covers it at high tide and uncovers it at low, and neither condition marks it in any way that the eye alone can follow. The stone and the gravel and the cold water over them are the same as the stone and gravel and water anywhere along that coast. What makes the spot specific is not the place itself, but the knowledge of what happened in it. And that knowledge lives in documents and local memory and the heritage marker that someone placed here to keep the connection between this ordinary shoreline and the extraordinary things that followed from it. The extraordinary things are all in the end downstream of the ordinary ones. The mystery followed the construction, the legend followed the disappearance, the poem followed the sailor's story, the opera followed the legend, the fiction followed the newspaper accounts, and somewhere in that long succession of forms, the thing that actually happened, whatever it was, on a specific stretch of the Atlantic in November and December of 1872, receded into the distance, still present somewhere in the record, but requiring more care to find than the stories that grew around it. What the careful finding produces in an archive reading room under low institutional light is documents, a ship's log with a date and a position and a notation made in someone's ordinary hand,